Welcome everyone to this first of 3 Transforming Evidence events that are around intermediary organisations. My name is Annette Boaz, and with Catherine Oliver I run Transforming Evidence. So first of all, a couple of housekeeping things. So we are recording this session. Many people wanted to attend who couldn't, so we're recording for their purposes. I hope that's okay, and that recording will be available after the event. Please could you mute yourselves just so we don't have the sort of background noise that occurs, and if you want to ask any questions, please could you put them in the chat, and we'll be gathering them up as we go along and feeding them to Vivian, who's going to be chairing the panel session. So please do share your questions with us. We'd really like to hear them. You can also join a discussion on Twitter. So we have the @transformingevidence account, and the hashtag is transform with a capital T, URE, and we'll put that in the chat for you. And you can also find out details about the next 2 sessions which are coming up on the Transforming Evidence website, and we'll also put that link in the chat. And finally, you might like to introduce yourselves to each other. We haven't really got time to go around and everyone introduce themselves, so if you want to do a little introduction in the chat panel, please do so. It's always nice to see people who are present. So I'm going to hand over to Vivian, who's going to do a short introductory talk, and then he's going to chair a panel discussion to hear from our other participants. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments as we go along. And thank you very much. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you so much, Annette. So I wanted to start by just presenting a slide. Okay. So for many of you who've studied the use of research evidence in policy and practice, you're probably familiar with this analogy that part of the challenge of getting research used in policy and practice is due to the fact that researchers and policymakers, or if you're thinking about researchers and practitioners, live in different communities. There are different, it's the 2 communities theory that Nathan Kaplan wrote about decades ago. And the idea being that the nature of the work that drives research, often in universities, but even outside of universities, and the nature of the work that's done in, say, a policy-making body or in a practitioner organization is so different. The nature of the work is different. The incentives that drive the work is different. The norms and the cultures of those worlds are so different. The language that is used in those different worlds is different, and there's so many things that cause them to live in different worlds and make the work of trying to bridge research with policy or with practice so challenging. Well, I think as over the last few decades, as we thought about this 2 communities theory, it's actually become much more complicated. And my good colleague Karen Bogenschneider makes the argument that it's not so much 2 different communities or 3 different communities of research, policy, and practice, or different islands on which people work, but it's much more like a complicated archipelago. That there are also all these little islands that sit between, you could think, the continents of research, policy, and practice. And it's actually a very busy, very nuanced, very complicated landscape. And I think that's what we're talking about today as we think about intermediary organizations. All these little islands that sit betwixt and between research and practice, or research, practice, and policy. And so today, I'm going to quickly talk about 3 ways which we might think about these intermediaries. One is I'm going to think a little bit about location. Physically, where are they located in relation to research, practice, and policy? I'm going to talk a little bit about chains. So if we start to think about an archipelago, it's rarely that there's just one island. Actually, when we think about intermediaries, there's often a lot of them, and sometimes chains of them in the path between research and practice, or research and policy. We'll think a little bit about those chains. And then also think a bit about when they are mediating. If we think about intermediaries as mediating, are they mediating evidence,
and then
or
when
are
Maya
they
goes in,
mediating relationships? And I will argue that there's both. Sometimes they're mediating evidence, sometimes they're mediating relationships. So let me take it down. So as we think about the different locations, I think when we look at the landscape of intermediaries, we see that there is a big wide open space, and some intermediaries sit much closer to the research community, while others sit much closer to the policy community, and still others sit much closer to the practice community. Now, I'm sure that the minute I say this, I'm going to get about 10 emails and 100 tweets telling me that that's not true, that they have organizations that sit exactly in between all of these communities. But my sense is, while that is true, that's often our aspiration to sit in a center space, many of these organizations, because of the way they develop, because of the way they're staffed, or because of who's funding them, often sit in a place that's a bit closer to one or the other of these communities. So if you think about those that are close to the research communities, this might be things like the National Academies of Sciences in the US that's doing a lot of work to try to synthesize evidence for policymakers. Sometimes they're commissioned by policymakers to synthesize evidence. Or you could think about other research funders that seek not just to fund research, but also to get it used by practitioners. Often these intermediaries focus a lot more, because they're closer to the research community, funded more by research funders, tend to think a lot more about rigor of the research evidence base. They think about things that matter a lot to the research community. So they tend to focus a lot more on perhaps the body of research evidence rather than one-off studies. You have other intermediaries like think tanks and advocacy organizations that tend to sit much closer to policymakers. And so by virtue of that, they're much more aligned to policymakers' needs in a very timely way, because they're often tracking in a real-time basis what our policymakers need. Now, they tend to be more adept and more comfortable with politics and the political dynamics of a situation. They tend to be more comfortable with incomplete evidence. They also can sometimes be more comfortable leveraging evidence to advance specific policy interests or policy goals, especially if they're more on the advocacy or lobbying side. Whereas if you think about the research intermediaries I just described, there's usually, not always, but more discomfort with navigating the politics of a situation, less comfort and less fluency navigating situations where the evidence base is really incomplete. Not that the evidence base is ever fully complete. But then you also have intermediaries that sit closer to practice. And these could be technical assistance providers that are trying to help folks maybe implement evidence-based programs, or helping to bring evidence to the table for practitioners as they implement different things, or as they figure out how to train staff to implement different things. Now, these intermediaries tend to be more aligned with practice dilemmas. What are the day-to-day challenges of practitioners and of agencies? They also tend to be more focused on implementation issues, because practice is where the rubber meets the road in a lot of ways. So you'll see that a lot of times those intermediaries are much more focused on implementation issues, and less so the higher level sort of policy issues. Now, these are general trends. This does not hold for everything, but I think it's helpful for us as we start to think about a landscape of intermediaries, of where different intermediaries spend their time. The other thing to consider then is these chains of intermediaries. And I think it makes a lot of sense because different intermediaries, especially given where they sit, tend to be stronger in performing certain intermediary functions than others. And so often when we get out into the world and we study the influence of intermediaries are often influenced by other intermediaries. So for example, a technical assistance provider that's helping a government agency implement a program or practice based on evidence is often getting it from maybe an intermediary that sits close to research, maybe a What Works Center, or maybe a national academy. And often when we follow the chain of influence, we'll see there's actually a whole chain of intermediaries. And that makes sense because at different ends of that archipelago, they have different trust, right? They're more trusted by one set of actors than another. They better understand the needs, the evidence needs, or the ways in which evidence would be implemented by one set of actors than another. So it becomes really important for us to think about this ecology, this ecosystem of intermediaries. And finally, I want to speak a little bit about when we talk about intermediaries, they're mediating, right? That's in the word mediating, or they're bridging, we could talk, or they're spanning boundaries. So what is it that they're mediating? Now, I think most often we think about them as mediating the evidence. Maybe they're synthesizing evidence, maybe they're translating evidence, maybe they're sharing evidence, or figuring out how to apply the evidence, right? It's very focused on evidence as a thing that's being moved. But actually, I would say some of the most effective intermediaries are also mediating relationships, or they're bringing researchers and practitioners, or researchers and policymakers together in more sustained relationships. And that can be sometimes the most promising work. And that's not to say it's either relationships or evidence. It's often, if they're mediating relationships, there's often some evidence being mediated as well. But the relationships can be very valuable because they lend themselves to a more iterative reciprocal process, where you could see that policymakers and practitioners have the opportunity then to shape research agendas. And then the research agendas and the research that's produced is more likely to be relevant and then to be trusted by policymakers. So when you're bridging the trusting relationships, that can create more of this interactive engagement and back and forth that can start to take on, when it's successful, a life of its own. And that can be a very important function of intermediaries. And I'm not sure that as a field, we think enough about what it takes to effectively span or bridge those relationships. And I would encourage us also to think about not just individual relationships, but organizational and institutional relationships, where those relationships can outlast any single person, because leadership does turn over, and where there are denser ties and just more opportunities for researchers, practitioners, policymakers to engage and inform each other. So with those introductory comments, I'm really looking forward to a very engaging and interactive dialogue. And I think what we're doing next is moving on to the first panel. Is that right, Jonathan? Okay. All right. Give me 1 minute to readjust here. Okay, so the next panel is called Knowing Our Place. What can evidence intermediaries do to influence wider systems? And I will be joined by 3 speakers. Holmes, the Director of Research and Practice based in the UK. Hello, Des. Fadi El-Jardali, the Director of Knowledge to Policy Center in Lebanon. And Kirchuffs Atengble, the Executive Director of PAX in Africa in Ghana. And I think we will proceed in the order in which they appear in the agenda. So Des, can I pass it off to you first?
You can. Thank you very much indeed, Vivian. I hope my sound's okay. I'm in sunny Bristol and I'm reliant on Richard Branson for my connection. So I hope I stay online. It's a real pleasure, although I'll be honest, it's also slightly daunting to be part of a panel with such illustrious people, and particularly colleagues who bring such academic expertise. The first thing I kind of want to say is that when I was invited to talk about, what it means to be an evidence intermediary organisation, I thought, oh, crikey, are we one of them? And I suppose I say that because You're absolutely right, Vivian, that depending on where you are in the system, and I think very, very, very few of us could really claim we're absolutely dead center, depending on where you are in the system, that shapes how you understand yourself and frame yourself. And we are, in the organisation that I lead, Research and Practice, I suspect when you were talking, I thought, yeah, I think we probably are closer to the practice island. And any UK-based social workers on the call might want to challenge me, but I don't think our practice community tend to use framing like evidence intermediaries. So that was the first point of, I guess, the thing I noticed. So I'm going to really, really briefly explain who we are. And I don't want to dwell on it, but I think it's important in terms of the context, because we're quite a diverse panel in terms of what our organisations and activities focus on. So Research and Practice is a not-for-profit organisation, part of a wider charitable trust. And put really simply, we help people who work with children and families, or with adults, or indeed both, to be evidence-informed in their work. So we support a network of members, largely local authorities and charities, with a particular focus on social work, social care, family support, justice services, occupational therapy. And at Research and Practice, we conceptualise evidence-informed practice as being about the triangulation of robust, relevant research and data, alongside professional wisdom and the expertise born out of lived experience. And that's quite important to be explicit about. We exist to promote critical thinking, evidence literacy, which is different, I think, to research compliance. We're trying to support sense making in quite a complex system. And so that's our core business, which is different from other organisations, for example, who might be focused very much on implementing discrete interventions that have been tested through trials, equally important, but different to our work. So depending on the nature of the intended user and the nature or construct of evidence in a particular field, these have real implications for our position within any given system. I really loved the metaphor that your colleague had, Vivian, about the archipelago, because I think the idea of separate islands or planets is too simplistic, not least, of course, because many people who go into research have a practice background. Many people go into practice because they have lived experience of the issues they want to try and research or practice within. So seeing the kind of blended, multifaceted nature of knowledge is really important, I think, to us. And this is going to be a little stretch now, I'm not an expert in islands at all, but I would go even further and say even within some of those quite small little islands, they are so diverse in terms of their complexion that it's like having a series of islands. So if I give one example, we support children's social care and adult social care, often within the same local authority. And yet much is made of the great differences between those user groups. So one example of that might be that in the UK, in England particularly, where we focus our work, there is a very different inspection and regulation framework for children's social care compared to that for adults. If we think about that as I would say that inspection regulation is a very powerful driver for how people think about evidence and evidence-informed practice. It's you might think of it as a bit like the tide that affects the shape and climate of any given island, and different sides of the island can feel like completely different planets. So there's lots and lots of diversity and complexity within the system that we're seeking to influence. We're primarily funded through our network of members. We call them partners, deliberately so. And I think that you're absolutely right, Vivian, when you talk about how the makeup, the positionality of your intermediary organisation, your funding arrangements are really influential in terms of your place in the system. So for us, I think it means that to a fair extent, we're allied with what you might call the demand side of the system, i.e. the people who use our resources and support, the people we're trying to help to access high quality evidence. And this requires us to focus on use, not simply reach. I'm not suggesting for a moment that if we were positioned in an even more allied sense with the supply side, the evidence generators, that we wouldn't care about use and we'd only care about reach. That would be too simplistic. But I think there is something about the flavour and tone you take on depending on where in the ecosystem or the solar system you are. It means for us at Research and Practice, we have to hold front and centre in our mind the intended benefits for the user, which in our case might be very busy social care professionals, and the end beneficiaries, i.e. the citizens they serve. And that affects how we design our offer, how we design our outputs, how we communicate our work, right down to things like the pictures we put on the front of publications. Now, in terms of the field that we're seeking to influence, so social care, social welfare within England, the nature of evidence is relevant. We are not swimming in RCT, in randomized controlled trials. We're not blessed with such a rich, a diverse field of what might be considered gold standard research, although I suppose I would challenge that idea of a hierarchy. For us, it means it's really vital that we support that system to interpret and build upon a variety of sources of knowledge. It means that we're occupying a space in the system where qualitative, ethnographic, observational methods are not just valued, but downright vital. Now, it might be very important that an experimental study finds a particular manualized program to be effective in a controlled environment. Great study. But it is of limited use to a practitioner who works directly with families who has no remit to commission that particular program. So part of our role is to share evidence of what works, to use that common shorthand, but much more than that is to help people think about what matters and why. So the nature of the audience and those we're trying to support, I would say audience is a bit passive for our taste. The people we're trying to support means it's really important that we have to be cognizant of their professional values, the paradigms and the context in which they work. Obvious example might be situating evidence in the context of extremely constrained resources and quite a complex policy landscape, which is currently very true of England's social care system. It wouldn't be enough to simply transmit evidence about the efficacy of a highly specialist intervention with a very high unit cost. That's not going to feel very relevant to cash-strapped local authorities. And we don't have the same mechanisms in our sector. So it's not like a medical treatment that could be tested, found to be effective and cost-effective, and then becomes embedded within health management guidelines. Worse than not being relevant, transmitting studies in that way could actually contribute to a rejection of evidence-mindedness per se. It could reinforce unhelpful narratives about, the lack of real-world relevant research. So it's more useful usually for our users to synthesize a range of studies and lots of different sources of knowledge, articulating core components rather than quite a narrow construct of fidelity. And of course, think about different levels. A very senior leader within the social care system needs different insights to those who are working directly with citizens. So being conscious of professional values is equally important there. Again, I'm going to think about social work here. One of the core parts of the social work value base is about empowerment, partnership working with citizens. So our work, our role in the system, our position in the system has to reflect that co-productive emphasis. We don't want citizens to be passive recipients of professional intervention, nor do we want professionals to be passive recipients of academic knowledge. So we're not so much focused on what you might call knowledge transfer, that kind of one-way conceptualization, the idea that expertise is held elsewhere and can be transmitted into practice. Partly because that knowledge transfer mindset, it kind of chimes with, I think it's Green who talks about the fallacy of the pipeline, this one-way conceptualization of translation and dissemination. There's a great quote from Green, talks about the blame for gaps between science and practice falls on the stubbornness of practitioners who insist on doing it their way, the hubris in believing they know best, and or the smugness of scientists believing that if they publish it, practitioners will use it. Which I think is a great quote. I often have to ask myself, am I over-identifying with a smug scientist or a stubborn practitioner, holding myself in healthy tension? Of course, the fallacy of the pipeline, this one-way conceptualization, that requires a fallacy of an empty vessel. The practitioner as a passive recipient, as a disengaged vessel in the knowledge creation process. So instead, we see our place in this system as being about emphasizing collaborative, dialogical co-creation of knowledge. And that enables greater congruence between the professional identity of our users and the evidence use agenda. Again, I'm going to steal a Green quote here because I think it's very relevant to our work. If we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. So thinking in that way has really led us in our organization to do lots of collaborative activities, change projects, action learning, action research, working with our members, our partners to co-produce outputs, handbooks, websites, board games, and then getting those to be tested by another group of users. We also have what are called link officers in every one of our member organizations. And we've been really influenced by the work of people like Vicky Ward and others, seeing these link officers not as account managers, but as knowledge mobilizers, the human vessel by which we pollinate new knowledge. And and really thinking about what humans need to stay motivated. You know, we hold award ceremonies for them, we do induction sessions, training, we take them away for a couple of days a year to learn together. And we have quite an intensive approach to supporting them. Again, really think about the human and often quite emotional kind of process of enabling knowledge use in a complex system. We've used the work of people like Sandra Nutley and Hugh Davis, who really emphasize issues like interaction, social influence and facilitation. And that's really led us to shape an offer which is much less about dissemination and much more about multi-dimensional, multi-level approaches to both sharing and receiving knowledge between research and practice. But also, as I say, seeing lived experience as part of that. So Matt Egan did a nice piece of work recently looking at complex systems and talks, I think, rather beautifully about complex system is one that produces their own pattern of behavior. It's emergent and self-organizing, not centrally organized. It's more than just a tangled set of relationships. It's about a system that behaves in a certain way. And I think for evidence intermediaries like us, seeing ourselves as actors within a system, knowing that we are part of a system, affected by it and can have an effect on it, really makes us think about our behavior. So if we think about systems leadership as often involving things like, it's collective, it's a team sport, not a solo sport. It's participative, not performative, and it's boundary spanning by design. These insights, they act as a bit of an anchor for us in how we behave, because we are trying to influence the behavior of another. In our case, a complex sector operating in a complex system. So it helps us, we think, when we're trying to influence behavior, to hold humility and credibility in a healthy tension. Acting as top-down experts, one-way transmitters of someone else's expertise, adopting a tone which suggests judgment, issuing advice that's divorced from the messy realities of practice. It can feel easier in the short term, but ultimately it's an own goal. We're trying to promote a mutually respectful, curious relationship between research and practice and policy and lived experience. And that means that we ourselves, as an intermediary, as the connective tissue sometimes, that means we have to model really respectful, curious behaviors ourselves. And I guess never losing sight of the fact that evidence utilization, evidence use, evidence-informed practice isn't an academic or clinical exercise. It's a human endeavor. It's being evidence-informed is a skin, not a jacket. It's who you are every single day in everything you do and the way you do it, not a coat you put on 9 to 5 at particular events or when writing particular papers. So I guess, that's the arts and humanities angle on the science of being an intermediary organization. I hope that made sense. And thank you for your talk, Vivian. It really, really chimed with me.
Thank you so much, Des. And it looks like Richard Branson came through today. All right, great. Let's pass it on to Fadi.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. I think there's a lot to be said about evidence intermediaries, and what I thought in my short intervention that I would be, first of all, more of describing briefly who we are, what we have done over the last many years, but certainly what we have learned about the work of the evidence intermediaries and the scaling up approach that we use since we were institutionalized. Also reflecting from my personal experience, I worked in governments before, I worked in practice and now in academia, and I've seen it from 3 different levels. And I think there's a lot of learning one can actually maybe generate as a result of what are evidence intermediaries, what they can do, what are the challenges, and how they can really evolve. So we are a center, a platform, a knowledge translation platform called K2P, Knowledge to Policy, located within a university. And by the way, my colleague before in the discussion about the location, you remind me about a paper that I published with colleagues in 2014, where we evaluated the governance and the location and the function of knowledge translation platforms in the one located in government versus the one located in universities or NGOs or civil society groups. And in fact, we realized there's no one size fits all. it all depends, structures follows function, but there's advantage and disadvantage to each of the setting. So there's no perfect model, to be honest with you, I have to say, about evidence intermediary. That if you're located in the government, you have the, you have the issue about institutionalization is great, sustainability, resources, skilled workforce. But if you work in university as an evidence intermediary and have that platform, you have the independence, you have the less political interference. You can speak truth to politics more than when you're working within the government. In NGO, civil society groups, we've seen it in other countries, it's very much donor dependent. And so there's a lot of factors. I'm not going to get into this, but you just reminded me about the issue about this, and we actually published that there's no one size fits all in that. So briefly about us, so we work at the interface between evidence policy and politics. So we engage with political forces, and that's something that we've learned over the last many years. We work and focus on health and social care systems. What we do is that we certainly engage in identifying priorities to push into government agenda. We actually work on addressing those priorities, so producing a suite of different knowledge translation products, from policy brief to briefing note to rapid response. I'm going to talk briefly about what we've learned as well from the rapid response from the COVID pandemic, because I think it's a game changer in the way we think about evidence intermediaries, as well as we do and work as we convene national high profile policy dialogues to promote collective problem-solving approach, particularly on the issues that requires intersectoral collaboration, things that are really at that level. We are designated by the World Health Organization as the collaborating center for evidence-informed policy and practice, and we are, work very closely and models after the McMaster has fallen at McMaster University. We have also a mentor institute to build and promote the use of evidence in policy. So our pillars in our center is really policy and action. So we work with very closely to push things to the agenda. We work on trying to refine, revise existing bills before it gets to legislation. We work on working to inform the implementation of specific legislation in terms of guidelines for action. We were able to stop some laws, and we were able to actually create some programs in communities, but also we failed in many times as well as evidence intermediary. So we have a lot of those learnings about what works, how it worked, but also why it didn't work, and how we can really readjust our mechanism of engagement. We have, again, beside the capacity building, we have a program for citizen and media engagement. So we have a product actually that we produce only to media to inform how media shape the narrative around public health related issues or social issues by using the evidence, as well as certainly we have a list of tools. So let me briefly, I don't know, we don't have a lot of time, but what I thought in my intervention is to give you a little bit more about some of the insights about what we have learned by our work to bridge the evidence policy action divide. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about the COVID experience. I think it's very important. We're not going to go into detail, but I think it's good to reflect on that, because I do believe it's a game changer in how we think for this function, and maybe some suggestions of how we think the function of evidence intermediary should actually be scaling up. The first of all is really one of the things that we have learned, that certainly in whatever country, whatever context you have to work on, you need to create the demand. You need to create a receptive culture for the use of evidence. That's why there's no one size fits all. There's no perfect guidelines to how to do that, but also there's a lot of mechanism and tools and strategies that we actually learned about how best to basically how we can demonstrate the value of using evidence to stakeholders, to policymakers, and to politicians. How we can create that culture for the demand for this type of particular evidence. And one of the things that we've learned, that you need to show successful and impactful stories. The aha moment for stakeholders comes after they see a certain demonstration of how that worked and what's in it for me, and how this would actually benefit our thinking, how will shape our way to how we can make them hear the noise and the music. Yes, it's important to know about the priorities and the concerns and the problem, but also the solution and what that means, the solution in terms of the benefits, harms, cost effectiveness, stakeholder reaction, and implementation consideration. So the sensitization about the use of evidence, creating that responsive culture, I think is very important. But important thing is also trust building, and this is very important, and it cannot be overlooked in promoting the use of evidence in policy making. So what that means, and you need you've seen in the pandemic, government was looking at a trusted source of evidence, and there was a lot, the wave of a humongous amount of evidence that was going on. But there was a lot of issues related to the quality of that evidence, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to remain objective, transparent, and politically neutral, particularly because we work from a university setting, particularly in a context where it's really highly politicized. So the minute you start taking sides, you lose the battle, I would say, as an evidence intermediary. You need to actually make sure, and this is again the perspective, but certainly investing in capacity building and creating the supply, the demand side, and making sure that you supply the stakeholders with the right evidence, you work with them in the knowledge co-production, etc. I think is very important. The second point is to promote policy relevant research, and I think this is very important. So it's not enough as an evidence intermediary to know and to engage stakeholders in identifying priorities that requires action at different level, legislation or policy or minister's decision, etc. But also, making sure that also the right evidence is really being produced or harnessed. That's why we ensure that we work on the three rights, work on the right priorities, the right timing, and the right framing, because this is what captures the political agenda, how we frame it. Now we have a new government, or we have plan for a new government, we have a new parliament, for example, our country that has been elected. This is perfect moment we'll start actually working and see how we can try to integrate that narrative that affect their thinking about how they think about the priorities and particularly the legislative one. That's why partnership between policymakers, providers, service providers, researchers is very, very important. The third thing is ensuring accessible and actionable evidence tailored to policymakers. And I think you all know that it's, in many of the policymakers I work with, they don't have time. They are overwhelmed by so many issues. They don't have time to read. The question is really how to provide that in a very, user-friendly, contextualized, simple, and making sure that this document that you're going to present is a one-stop shop document, meaning if you look at this, you don't need to look at anything else because it captures everything and give you what you actually require in a short period of time. But certainly also making sure that leveraging on the evidence intermediary organization should leverage on whatever opportunity for knowledge uptake. That's why engaging a citizen, having a public consultation. We work with media, and we know how difficult to work with media, but we work with NGOs, with advocacy organizations. We work also to support creating that type of advocacy for action, particularly when the government does not respond to some of the things that we actually pushing for them in order to influence their agenda setting or at least policy instrument or policy implementation. So we work on showing the impact. I believe the impact is the driving force. And that's why we need, as evidence intermediary, to work more and more to measure that impact and to show it in order to actually start to create that learning. Now, let me finish by mentioning about the COVID pandemic. And I think, again, I still repeat, this is as you know, during the pandemic, all decision makers, politicians, government were really under tremendous pressure to respond urgently. There was a tsunami of information, a broad range of evidence, but there was an issue with the quality of that evidence. It was scattered. It was not easy to interpret and to translate into quick and real-time decisions. That's why, at the time of crisis, evidence intermediaries, whether they are organizations or initiatives or networks, they play a very important role in not only engaging and identifying priorities, but also making sure that they are, understanding the type of evidence, how to deal with uncertainty when you have uncertainty in the evidence, how to harness the best available evidence and position it in real time to stakeholders, how to contextualize it, how to put it in an actionable way, how to build that trust, and making sure that you create that cross-sectoral dialogue. As you know, in the time of the pandemic, all sectors were involved. And there was a lot, I would say, of dysfunctions in many countries when it comes to intersectoral collaboration. And we've seen a lot of issues and barriers related to that. That's why I think evidence intermediary as one way forward, they need to start working on rapid response systems, how they can really try to reach out, cater to the need of the wider audience, even beyond government and policymakers, because at the time of COVID, we realized that we have to actually work downstream and upstream. We have to work with government and policymakers, but we have to work with municipalities, with healthcare providers, with influencers, with civil society groups, with the religious figures, with the influencers. So because they are real driver of change at different levels. So, and I want to end to say that, you know, as part of our journey at Evidence Intermediary, we kept working on monitoring and evaluating what we do so we can learn better of how we do things. Again, we have some successes, we have some failures, but we're learning from failure as much as we're learning from successes. That's why we're now, we you know, scaled up our work. We have a specific program now called K2 Parliament, which is focusing on politicians. We have K2 People with work with citizens, and we have also K2 Policy. We're actually focusing on policy. 1 month ago, we were able to successfully, you know, change the narrative of how, you know, candidates that are running for election, how they can start working on actually putting political platforms that are really based on evidence, how they can tackle issues related to economy, social policies, health policy, whatever, but making sure really that those promises are based on evidence, not based on political rhetoric. So we're creating that observatory to actually work and actually monitor to what extent they met the criteria. So there was a, you know, more of clear guidelines that we have developed. We went to media, we engaged with all the political candidates, which now already some of them are elected, but we are making sure that we want to create the structure, the incentive, the system, and the processes to institutionalize the use of evidence in policymaking process. So evidence intermediary should not be always working on demand or on a request basis. Yes, we work on that, but how to change that culture, how we can, you know, engage with the broader ecosystem, evidence to policy ecosystem, how to make sure that we engage with different sectors, but how we ensure that this is becoming institutionalized. So that's why I would say the pandemic created unprecedented appetite for promoting the use of evidence in policy. And I think evidence intermediaries can play a very important role to harness those lessons in order to actually go into the next level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fadi. Really appreciate the focus on institutionalization so that we don't come out of this pandemic period in the same place that we went into it. Thank you so much. So now let's hear from our third speaker, Kirchuffs. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. So maybe start with the correct pronunciation.
So the name is Kirchuffs Atengble.
Kirchuffs.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I would want to share my screen, and I hope you can see now. Yeah, great. So as I mentioned, I'm Kirchuffs and I'm Executive Director for Pax Africa. My session is just going to be guided by these two basic questions, which frames this particular session, which focuses on systems. How can intermediaries navigate and influence this wider system? And then what can evidence intermediaries do to influence wider systems? So that's the perspective from which I will be speaking. And very often we prefer to identify what we're doing as a systems approach, taking a systems approach. And so the first question we'll be looking at is how do we navigate the wider system? And for us, we think that it's more of gaining knowledge and understanding of the system to know how then what to do and who to engage, and depending on what you seek to do. And when we talk about the evidence ecosystem, we are guided very much by this definition that we coin, being adapted from other scholars within the field. So we consider it as an interconnected relationship between producers and users, but also having in the intermediaries of evidence whose interaction generates opportunities. So a keyword in there, apart from being interconnected, is opportunities. What opportunities are we creating for ourselves, all actors within the ecosystem? And then we're aiming for continuous and enhanced work that we do. So works may include creation of evidence, the synthesis of those, the translation, as well as use of evidence. And very often we look at use from two main perspectives. So from a policy perspective and then from a practice perspective. And we, at the moment, have been focused more on the policy side of those. Now, when we look at the evidence system ecosystem, we have three main categories of actors. One are the producers. And when we talk of producers, we conceptualize those to include policy research institutions, universities, think tanks, but to a large extent also government agencies. And let me acknowledge here that these categorizations are not mutually exclusive, to indicate that whether you're a producer, you still make some use of evidence. And although it may not be for ultimate public policy, there is some use of those. And if you're a producer, if you're a user as well, there are certain things that you do that contribute to evidence production. And those in the middle equally do some production and then the use of those. But the objective of those production and use may not be the same across these different actors. Now, apart from producers, we have the users, who basically include policy formulators, implementers, program managers, members of parliament, assembly members. So from the national level down through to subnational local government systems. And yeah, those are those that we consider evidence users. But then the very side which is of interest to this very conversation today are the evidence intermediaries. And here we're looking at all other actors who are involved in some way or the other in the aggregating, synthesizing, translating, curating, funding, even enforcing quality control and building capacity within the ecosystem. So all of the actors we conceptualize within this bigger group called the intermediaries. So I saw a question come up earlier from Claire. This is the direction that we consider some of these. And one of our works we've been doing called the evidence landscape is to map out the ecosystem in Ghana to understand who is doing what and contributing what to which other organization, kind of trying to understand the dynamics within the system. So we're still working on the reports, and we're getting to understand that the roles that the actors play within the ecosystem vary, and again are not mutually exclusive. So within organizations, we can see multiple of these roles within organizations, and then across organizations within the ecosystem, we see these different actors come, or these different roles come up. So we have those who are aggregators of evidence, including the data, the research, the citizen knowledge, practice, informed knowledge, and expert opinions, and all of those. So there are those who aggregate these and present them to other actors within the ecosystem. There are synthesizers who bring them up into summaries and other forms that synthesize knowledge in a more succinct use. There are those who translate these resources into other forms. So when we talk of knowledge translators or evidence translators, our key conceptualization relates to the change of evidence, or the transformation of evidence from one media to the other. It could be from maybe a bulk systematic review to a summary. It could also be from a summary to a video, to a speech, to other different formats. So those are those we consider as translators. Then there are the curators, very important, but very often are overlooked within our conceptualization. Curators are those who provide repository and retrieval services to the different things we do. So libraries are very key in this role. And then academic journals, for instance, are considered within those. They provide those kind of curation services in there. Then funders as well, because they provide resources, especially financial resources, to help with either production or the use side of our activities, and also very often to the activities of intermediary organizations. Then we have organizations that provide quality control services, including the ethics review commissions and committees at the various universities, for instance. They provide very critical roles in here that we consider important for survival and sustenance of the ecosystem within institutions and across the ecosystem. And then the final bit where we identify ourselves the most as a capacity development actors, who also try to understand the different capacity dynamics within the ecosystem, where there are gaps, and to see how to enhance the competencies within those, the motivations, the skills essential to cause transformation, the resource availability, how to map out policies, for instance, and procedures, technologies that can be deployed for growth of individuals, organizations, and then the system as a whole. So on that note, I would want to move to the second bit of my submission, which is influencing the wider ecosystem. How do we do that? So as an organization, Pax Africa, we've been around for the past 5 years. Just this past March, we launched our second strategic plan. And in the first 5 years, we've been running more on ad hoc interventions, trying to understand the ecosystem, providing services to government agencies. So we identify ourselves primarily as a youth-led organization involved in capacity development. So we are a think tank because we do research, but we're not a typical policy think tank. We identify as a capacity development think tank. And we're a private, not-for-profit organization. And the final of our identities is that we are Pan-African in our orientation. So over the first 5 years, we've been trying to understand some of these dynamics, and which informs the way we do things going forward. And what we have on my screen now are the 3 key things that we do as an organization. One is to research into ecosystem issues, and then those knowledge are used for 2 main things. One, to design capacity development interventions for our beneficiary organizations and partners, and then also to inform the design again of the tools that we employ, so that the different tools that we employ are not just taken from a vacuum. They are built around the knowledge of the context, knowledge that we gain from our organizations and in the system as a whole. So, and then that's the second bit of our work, which is OD, mostly organization development. And then the third bit is our advocacy side of things, aiming for ecosystem development ultimately. So some of our lead programs for our research into ecosystems, for instance, is the evidence landscape that I spoke about, which is giving us much detail into the operations, the actors and their operations within the ecosystem and what they are producing, for instance, so that if there are other actors who may need these resources, these evidence products, but are not privy to the availability of those, then we map them to these so that we all get, to grow together. Then we started also a pilot of a context matters matrix, which is a quantitative tool that helps us to understand the dynamics within an organization and seeing how each organization within their context is making use of opportunities available for them to enhance their use of research and data and other kinds of evidence. And then the third, and not the least under those, is the political economy analysis works that we've done in the past. Some of those have been under partnerships with other actors, other actors within the ecosystem. And we also did one on capacity development, interventions by government within Ghana, the government agencies, to understand what opportunities and what, the institutional arrangements, who conceptualizes evidence, for instance, who takes the initiative to develop capacity, who gets to decide who and who, to be trained, what mechanisms are used. Is it training alone, or is it in combination with other mechanisms for capacity development and all of those? So their reports are available. We're wrapping up on the public version of those reports because some sensitive issues came up in those as well that we wouldn't want to be public. So we're preparing a public version that will be put out in due course of time. Then some of our works under organization development, this year we introduced the counterpart funded OD projects, again informed by some of our research that we conducted in the past, from which we got to know that government agencies obviously have budgets dedicated to capacity development. So if those ad hoc interventions that we've been providing to them in the past have been useful for them, why then don't we share costs? We understand Ghana, for instance, is a developing country, and so funds available for capacity development, as part of bigger government budgets are not so much, and so we don't want to leave them all to bear that cost. So previously, we used to look for funding from other external actors, development partners, and interested think tanks and universities to provide those support programs. But considering this insight that we're getting, we started this year with 3 government agencies, 1 from the evidence production side, 2 from the policy side, to see how we can help them improve on the systems and opportunities generally available for improved evidence use. So that's at the central government level. The other one, which is the ICADO project, is at the sub-national level, where we try to help sub-national governments to see equally how to improve evidence use for policy. So down there, they do more of policy implementation, for instance, and a bit more, a bit of policy decision, kind of the initiation of policy, mostly happening at the central level, but at the sub-national level, although they do some policy initiatives, they initiate some policy decisions, the bulk of what they do of implementation style. So we contextualize our interventions and see how we can support them to make the most of the evidence that inform the implementation. So more of a monitoring, evaluation, decisions, data and reports from different actors that inform decisions that are made, more also of citizen opinions to guide the implementation of programs after the first round. For instance, the learning is made, shared with community members, get their feedback. How are they reacting to these development interventions? And that also informs the changes that can be introduced by these development partners. I mean, at the national level, at the sub-national level for the different initiatives that they implement. And then the third one down there is from an internal perspective. So within the organization as well, we have been doing some capacity development work. And this, for instance, is to give opportunity for young people to be mentored to become corporate evidence leaders. And so although whilst serving under this mentorship program, they will be helping initiatives of PACs to be implemented, they will be developing competencies that could be taken out to other leadership roles after the mentorship program. The program currently runs for a year, between a year and 2. And then by the time we are okay that these actors are competent enough, we graduate them from the program, and then they move on as well. The final bit of our work includes the breakfast and courtesy meetings, most of which we have with high-level political actors and administrative officers, our annual evidence dinners that we're going to start next year, and then the Africa Evidence Week, which we support as well. Now, the final bit.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but would you mind just wrapping up quickly so we can be sure to get some questions in?
Sure. So this is the final slide that I'll be sharing, which kind of gives indication of some of the emerging outcomes from our work, including, so we take it from the 3 different strand of activities that I shared earlier. So we have been producing some high-end context relevant knowledge for the ecosystem, particularly for use by government agencies as well as ourselves. And then we have supported or contributed to improve staff competencies. And in that picture there, we see the Parliament of Ghana, for instance, which has benefited a lot from our works at PAX. And then there's the Ministry of Health and then the Environmental Protection Agency, who have all benefited from our work. Then we have also contributed to high-profile political commitments to EIDM within Ghana and across the sub-region. We have worked towards collaborations, maximizing those for improved EIDM. We've had some great high-value international collaborations. In that picture in there, colleagues from the University of Southampton. I saw that from the participants list that some people will be coming from in there. Yes, University of Southampton, the University of Indiana, and a couple of others. The University of Johannesburg have been all part of actors that we have worked with. And then we believe we have contributed a lot to increase international recognition for EIDM in the sub-region of Africa. And then as an organization as well, we are gradually building our profile in that domain. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights and your experiences. So we've actually got some very interesting questions in the chat box, and I'd like to start with this one. Kirchuffs, would you, thank you so much. I'd like to start with this one by Bay Schmidt, which is to say, she asks whether and how you have monitored or otherwise evaluated your work as intermediaries. So I think part of what she's getting at here is that as evidence intermediaries, to what extent are you collecting evidence on your own work and using it to monitor and improve your work? Knowing that that's kind of a metaphor to do, but any one of you want to talk about your efforts to evaluate or monitor your work?
If you want me, I can come in very briefly. We
Sure.
Definitely over the last many years, we've realized that this is definitely an important area that we need for a lot of investment. And what we have done is that we have started working on tools to start really measuring not necessarily outputs to outcomes, but also in terms of impact. Take into consideration that we rarely you can find a decision or a legislation or any policy direction that was really impacted 100% by evidence. There's always many factors that come to play. It's not really only evident that, but the key is really how to devise those tools and strategies where you can really understand that association relationship in terms of what you have done, not necessarily causation, because rarely you can find that. I have to say it's not feasible. So what we have done, we published some work on that. We've done, for example, policy tracing. So we've done a policy tracing technique where we actually trace either backward or actually in a prospective way in terms of from the time we actually do this intervention, in the certain period of time, what will happen? Sometimes we do 6 months follow-up survey with the key stakeholder involved. Sometimes we do really content analysis of the draft legislations. For example, in front of me, when we work on changing the draft law related to legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes, we worked before and we worked to actually monitor the deliberation within the parliamentary committee that work on that to see to what extent, whether they use it, how they use that evidence, and what are the evidence that they didn't use and why. So it's really understanding this. It's not really whether they are using the evidence or not. It's really about how they are using it, because this is very important question one need to keep in mind. So it's not as straightforward, but certainly this is something it's very important in terms of research. There's a lot to be done into the science, investing in the science of knowledge translation, which I believe this is very important. And I think all evidence intermediaries should invest more and more work and actually publish some of the learning that is being generated. Over.
Thank you so much. And I saw Des nodding her head vigorously. So would you like to pipe in too, Des?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, the simple answer is, of course, we're continually trying to work out whether what we're doing is remotely effective or congruent, because we're trying to model behaviors, and different parts of how we work lend themselves more easily. So in terms of continuous improvement, I talked about our link officers, like knowledge mobilizers, working with them in an ongoing way to capture feedback and act on it, and just always be sharpening our tools or learning from our mistakes. Some of our methods, like CPD, training programs, of course, we use things like training transfer theory to underpin how we do the evaluation of the impact of training, which is, of course, completely different to the feedback on training. Whether the room was warm enough and the orange juice was cold enough tells you nothing about whether that training got transferred into practice or policy, of course. And some things, frankly, we haven't cracked. I'm yet to find a way of saying whether reading that publication made you better at your job. And so that returns to the theme of humility. Never, ever wanting to remotely get close to pretending that being part of our network is the reason why you achieved X in your job. Trying to be really, really humble about the contribution we make to an evidence-informed ecosystem, but never wanting to kind of over-attribute the role you've played, and also showing our mistakes, showing our members all the stuff that we do that doesn't work, because we're trying to model evidence-informed mindsets to them. And, having a theory of change that underpins our offer, that kind of thing. I don't know if that helps at all to answer the question.
It totally does. And actually it gets me to a question I've been wanting to ask, which is that we can learn a lot from our mistakes and our missteps. So we have a lot of people on this Zoom call who are themselves intermediaries. So what advice would you pull up from missteps or regrets that you have had in your work that we could all learn from? Oh, Des, okay.
I don't want to treat this like therapy, colleagues. So again, I'll be brief, but I deeply, not regret, I wish that I hadn't inherited such a fabulously strong brand from my predecessor, because that made it not possible to change our name. And our name is not helpful, because we don't only care about getting research in practice, we care about getting practice in research and policy in practice and lived experience in policy and also because it meant for a long time our website was rip.org.uk, and we don't intend to rest in peace. We're quite busy. So there is something about how your brand and naming, beyond the glibness, you have to work really hard to show who you are sometimes, because the brand is more complex than the name. That's one thing that really strikes me.
My apologies. We're going to go over just about 5 to 10 minutes. We understand if some people have busy schedules and they need to run on, but we just want to get in time for another question or two, and then time for Dr. Annette Boaz to wrap up. But this is, I think, a really intriguing question that came to us. And I'm just going to read it because I think it's so well posed. It says, so some of the speakers have alluded to power dynamics of intermediaries. And can we see the intermediaries as peripheral insiders operating in invited spaces? In which case, if you're invited in or you're welcomed in, you are closer to some people in certain positions of power. Okay, now I'm embellishing. Does maintaining trust and a privileged position mean playing by the rules to some extent of the folks who've invited you in? Are intermediaries also knowledge gatekeepers then, working within systems that may favor some types of knowledge over the others? And then, has the pandemic shown us any limitations and opportunities around the power dynamics of intermediaries or insider-outsider science? So it's really inviting us to think in more nuanced ways about the power dynamics that play when you are an intermediary. So who would like to take that on first?
Would you like me to go in?
Yes, please. And then maybe Kirchuffs too.
So just briefly, and I think it's on the power dynamic, and I have to say, I think it's working in a policy context is not straightforward. There is a lot of complex dynamics you have to navigate within the system and understand very well who holds the power, who is the policymakers, who is the policy takers, etc., etc. But I think one of the key things, really, the challenge of evidence intermediary is how to actually, make sure you protect your independence, objectivity, and neutrality while you are working with people in power. It's not easy. It's not easy. In fact, in many cases, sometimes they seduce you by actually engaging you and inviting you in because they want you to be part of that game. And the question is really how to deal with that. They are your partners. You want to work with them, but at the same time, you need to actually this. For example, during the COVID-19, there was a lot of at many levels in government. There were national committees, and of course, they want to invite evidence intermediary. But the question is, many of those decisions that is being done at that time of the pandemic were actually political because of many factors beyond just only health and evidence. The minute you are in, you are actually stamping on many of the decisions that you actually, in fact, is very much stand against what you are advocating for when it comes to evidence. So it's not easy. I'm not providing solution, but I think it's a case-by-case basis. You need to understand that power dynamics. You need to work in a very smart, intelligent way, keeping them partners, but at the same time also protecting your independence and not to be, very much quick in actually getting into some of those engagements that might actually label you at some point, whether you are with government or against government, etc. Because the minute you actually get labeled and you don't protect that brand, you actually will have challenges in actually sustaining and staying to be a trusted power, a trusted source of evidence. Over.
Right. Kirchuffs or Des, do you want to address this? Yes, go ahead.
So thank you very much for the question, and it's quite an interesting one because it's so real, and it's across the ecosystem, from producers, users, and even the intermediaries. We sometimes want to project power in, to achieve what we want to do, and this is where the challenge comes in. Very often we, from the laid back, it's so easy to assume that power projection comes from the political actors only, but it's not always the case, because we have had instances of dealing with power issues with other actors, even within the intermediary space, where people will want to influence the way you do things, what you use, and how you do the different things. But very often, I think my recommendation on those is to approach our work with genuine interest, so that where these influences are coming, it's not to fight it, but to engage with these actors to get them to understand the need to be original in the work that we're doing. They can share their concerns, they can share their views, their fears even, but that's not to influence the way we want to do things. We are to be allowed, and it gives us also that responsibility to be transparent in the way we do things and to communicate or share, be open about how we are going about our work, either as translators or capacity developers or knowledge brokers, or which other roles that we play within the intermediary space. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think that's a superb question. There's about 15 blogs in that. If the person asking it would like to start writing, that'd be terrific. Thank you. So from a slightly different angle, because as I described, we're not primarily, we're not funded by, for example, policymakers or government colleagues. So I want to kind of build on and complement what's been said so far. I think being invited in, so our network of members, of research users, fund the work we do for our network. So being invited in sometimes means you're welcome, but it depends how you set out your story. You have to be really clear that you're inviting me in to be honest and challenging to you. You're not inviting me in to tell you the answers you want to hear. So that's there's a fairly obvious point to make there. And so for intermediaries in this position that we find ourselves in the ecosystem, you've got your North Star is that you have to be an honest broker. That's not quite the same as striving for scientific objectivity. I think particularly when you have an expansive definition of knowledge, qualitative knowledge, for example, but maybe about being more conscious in your subjectivity. And so you have a choice, I think, particularly in our sector, which is about human services and often working with some of the most marginalized people in our communities, people who've experienced oppression, often at the hands of the state. Indeed, you have a choice whether you want to reinforce or disrupt the existing power dynamic. And so for us, that's particularly relevant in how we conceptualize knowledge. Knowledge isn't neutral. You know, knowledge is in and of itself absolutely riddled with complex kind of power structures and things. And so if we think about, for example, I think I'm right in saying in the UK, like 0.7% of professors are Black. Less than 5% of institution heads come from an ethnically minoritized background. We know that female academic output dropped by about 60% in the pandemic. It's almost like working from home isn't really working when you're a woman. Discuss. We know that researchers from user-led organizations, for example, disabled researchers tend to have their work underfunded and not funded alongside. So actually the evidence we have to work with has power and privilege writ through it, you know? And so you have to be conscious of that, not treat it as if it's neutral in the first place. I think it's one of the really important myths that as evidence intermediaries we have to counter, the idea that there are simply facts and they are immune to all the awfulness of human nature and bias and blind spots. No, they're not. They are replicant of our biases and blind spots and power imbalances. So you've got to play with a really, really straight bat.
Yes. Just give me 5 minutes and I'm coming, all right?
Okay, thank you, Des. I'm going to give each of you just, if you could, in 30 seconds, maybe the last word that you would like to leave our audience with, and then I'm going to pass it over to Annette, Boaz to wrap us up. But I would say in these conversations, we've just heard different perspectives from intermediaries that sit in different positions and different locations. I think this has actually been a very nice illustration of that folks in different positions have different levels of comfort and desire to engage in some of these issues around power, around values, how much they want to center it. That across all of you, there's been conversations about the importance of credibility and of trust. But I think what credibility and trust looks like and how to garner it can look different, whether you're closer to research, closer to practice, or closer to policy, because the ways in which you trust evidence depends a bit on where you sit in this ecosystem. So with that, let me throw it back to you. Maybe we'll go in the opposite order of presentation, start with Kirchuffs, you know, a brief closing comment, and then Fadi, and then Des.
Seems my prayer came to pass, since I wanted to continue from where Des ended. And I must acknowledge that it's very important to consider the power dynamics within this work that we do. And that's what seems to be coalescing into what we call decolonizing knowledge systems or evidence systems, where we try to look at where the dynamics are oriented out, tilted, and who is influencing what, and how do we level the field, or how do we enhance the opportunities, the voices of other less represented, you know, demographics. So gender voices, for instance, on different issues are very important. That it brings to mind one PhD program I've put up in application for on, say, similar, you know, issues. And these are very important. And although it happens in developing countries and in developed countries, so irrespective of where we are, we need to contribute to these within our respective fields. Thank you.
So I just wanted to just say that I think we have a a great opportunity now at Evidence Intermediaries, particularly about what we have learned from COVID-19, given that there's a lot of importance was given by different countries, heads of states, politicians to the role and the importance of evidence. But this is so there's a lot of responsibility, great opportunity. But I think we need to start more working to harness, I would say, the strengths of the complementary evidence networks and establish a little bit more synergies and avoid duplication. and waste of resources. And I'm talking here not even at the national level, but also at the regional and the global level. There's a lot of efforts can be made in order that we can learn from each other, but also we actually exchange and try to understand and synergize. I think this is very important. The second is that we have to acknowledge, we need to engage with political forces. We need to be transparent. The key is transparency at the same time and addressing conflict of interest. But I think we also understand that the prevalence of political decisions despite availability of scientific evidence. And I think that we've seen it in COVID-19. There was a strong scientific evidence, but there was a political decision. However, our role should always stay that how to ensure scientific advice is strongly integrated in the political decisions. And I think this is really very critical in terms of how we think this. And the last thing I want to mention about the contextualization of the evidence is very critical. Evidence is all depends how you are, and knowledge, how we're defining it. But the work, the role and responsibility to co-produce knowledge, to engage, policy makers and policy implementers in the co-production of knowledge and the co-design of feasible solution is very critical. So it's not really about looking at systematic reviews, looking at effectiveness and sending them just a policy advice. You need to actually put it within the context. I think there's a lot to actually work and learn more from that as we move forward. Over to you.
I agree so much with my colleagues who've spoken already. I don't want to duplicate. I guess the final word for me, and I may be thinking particularly about the sector we serve, but I'm sure it's true in all the fields that colleagues in this call work in. I think we need to engage much more the hearts and minds bit of this. Those of us who are interested in evidence and evidence use are a particular breed. The rest of the world is interested in other stuff. I think they're more fun at parties maybe than we are. You have to find the moral purpose, the hook, the what makes people's hearts sing. In my bit of the system, people get out of bed because they believe in changing lives, in supporting children who've been harmed, in helping adults lead a fulfilling and fulfilled life. And so you've got to connect your interest in evidence usage to their reason for being. You've kind of got to make it cool and fun and joyful to use evidence. There's a task for us. How do we make such geeky, highbrow, highfalutin concepts feel cool and joyful? Because I think that's probably how we change the world. If citations could change the world, they'd have done so by now.
Well, that's a fine way to wrap up the panel. Thank you so much to my colleagues for such insightful comments and for sharing your experiences with us. And now over to Annette.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you everyone for those fantastic contributions. I've written reams and reams of notes and lots of Twitter. So I just wanted to wrap up very quickly, mainly to signal the next event, which is going to be on the 21st, and we're going to shift the conversation to thinking more about should intermediary organisations be involved in this advocacy type work we started talking about, and I think it's an interesting and contentious kind of debate topic for us to talk about when we come together again. Also to flag that Travis put in the chat that an opportunity to map the archipelago. He created a Padlet and it would be great to do that. And given we're going to come back together a couple of times, we can have those opportunities to keep feeding into that. Thanks for putting that in the chat again. It's right at the end. That was such a rich way of thinking. I have to say at the moment, I'm just taking away the idea that we might all be terrible at parties, but there was so much more. And so I just want to say a massive thank you to our speakers and also to the amazing participants today. Looking down the list and seeing who's here, I would love to have you all in a room together because I think we would have so many interesting conversations, so many parallels across different geographies, across different challenging policy areas, and also from people working in different perspectives. So thank you everybody, and looking forward to coming back together again on the 21st of June, and hopefully we'll see you then.